Furthermore, the issue of state sovereignty had been raised. In Georgia, a movement had begun which was distinctly different from the Virginia-Carolina movement of opposition, a movement for which Rhett and Pollard had scarcely more than disdainful tolerance. And not always that. This parallel opposition found vent, as did the other, in a political pamphlet. On the subject of conscription, Davis and the governor of Georgia, that same Joseph E. Brown, who had seized Fort Pulaski in the previous year, exchanged a rancorous correspondence. Their letters were published in a pamphlet of which Pollard said scornfully that it was hawked about in every city of the South. Brown, taking alarm at the power given the Confederate government by the Conscription Act, eventually defined his position and that of a large following in the extreme words, "No act of the government of the United States prior to the secession of Georgia struck a blow at constitutional liberty so fell as has been stricken by the Conscription Acts." There were other elements of discontent which were taken form as early as the autumn of 1862, but which were not yet clearly defined. But the two obvious sources of internal criticism just described were enough to disquiet the most resolute administration. When the Triple Offensive broke down, when the ebb tide began, there was already everything that was needed to precipitate a political crisis. And now the question arises whether the Confederate administration had itself to blame. Had Davis proved inadequate in his great undertaking? The one undeniable mistake of the government previous to the autumn of 1862 was its excessive secrecy. As to the other mistakes attributed to it at the time, there is good reason to call them misfortunes. Today we can see that the financial situation, the cotton situation, the relations with Europe, the problem of equipping the armies were all to a considerable degree beyond the control of the Confederate government. If there is anything to be added to its mistaken secrecy as a definite cause of irritation, it must be found in the general tone given to its actions by its chief detractors. And here there is something to be said. With all his high qualities of integrity, courage, faithfulness, and zeal, Davis lacked that insight into human life which marks the genius of the supreme executive. He was not an artist in the use of men. He had not that artistic sense of his medium which distinguishes the statesman from the bureaucrat. In fact, he had a dangerous bent toward bureaucracy. As Reuben Davis said of him, gifted with some of the highest attributes of a statesman, he lacked the plainness which enabled a man to adopt his measures to the crisis. Furthermore, he lacked humor. There was no safety valve to his intense nature, and he was a man of delicate health. Mrs. Davis, describing the effects which nervous dyspepsia and neuralgia had upon him, says he would come home from his office fasting, a mere mass of throbbing nerves, and perfectly exhausted. And it cannot be denied that his mind was dogmatic. Here are dangerous lines for the character of a leader of revolution. The bureaucratic tendency, something of rigidity, lack of human physical wretchedness, dogmatism. Taken together, They go far toward explaining his failure in judging men, his irritable confidence in himself. It is no slight detail of a man's career to be placed side by side with a genius of the first rank without knowing it. But Davis does not seem to ever have appreciated that the man commanding in the 7 days' battle was one of the world's supreme characters. The relation between Davis and Lee was always cordial, and it brought out Davis's character in its best light. Nevertheless, so rooted was Davis's faith in his own abilities that he was capable of saying, at a moment of anxiety, "If I could take one wing and Lee the other, I think we could between us wrest a victory from those people." And yet his military experience embraced only the minor actions of a young officer on the Indian frontier and the gallant conduct of a subordinate in the Mexican War. He had never executed a great military design. His desire for the military life was, after all, his only ground for ranking himself with the victor of 2nd Manassas. Davis was also unfortunate in lacking the power to overcome men and sweep them along with him, the power Lee showed so conspicuously. Nor was Davis adverse to sharp reproof of the highest officials when he thought them in the wrong. He once wrote to Joseph E. Johnston that a letter of his containing arguments and statements utterly unfounded, and insinuations as unfounded as they were unbecoming. Davis was not always wise in his choice of men. His confidence in Bragg, who was long his chief military adviser, is not sustained by the military critics of a latter age. His cabinet, though not the contemptible body caricatured by the malice of Pollard, was not equal to the occasion. Of the 3 men who held the office of Secretary of State, Toombs and Hunter had little, if any, qualifications for such a post, while the third, Benjamin, is the Sphinx of Confederate history. In a way, Judah P. Benjamin is one of the most interesting men in American politics. By descent a Jew, born in the West Indies, he spent his boyhood mainly at Charleston and his college days at Yale. He went to New Orleans to begin his illustrious career as a lawyer, and from Louisiana entered politics. The keenness of his intellect is beyond dispute. He had the Jewish clarity of thought, the wonderful Jewish detachment in matters of pure mind, but he was also an American of the middle of the century. His quick and responsive nature, a nature that enemies might call summative, caught and reflected the characteristics of that singular and highly rhetorical age. He lives in tradition as the man of the constant smile, and yet there is no one in history whose state papers contain passages of fiercer violence in days of tension. How much of his violence was genuine? How much was a matter of speaking? His biographers have not had the courage to determine. Like so many American biographers, they have avoided the awkward questions and have glanced over, as lightly as possible, the persistent attempts of Congress to drive him from office.